focus on what matters.
Welcome to our News Shapers, the Global Climate Bulletin virtual event. I'm Ben Yeeman, energy reporter at Axios, and I'm coming to you from the COP26 United Nations Climate Conference in Glasgow, Scotland. Welcome to our audiences on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, LinkedIn, and on Axios.com. Please join the conversation today on Twitter with @Axios and hashtag AxiosEvents. Over the next 30 minutes, I'll be joined by my colleague David Lawler. We'll outline what to expect as the COP26 conference unfolds and discuss what leaders in the global fight against climate change aim to accomplish through the conference agenda and beyond. Our first guest is the president and CEO of the United Nations Foundation, Ambassador Elizabeth Cousens, also joining us from Glasgow. Hi, Ambassador.
Hi, Ben. Great to see you.
Likewise, and thanks for being with us. Ambassador, I'd love to start with how you're taking the pulse of the conference thus far. You know, we've had these big pledges on methane and finance and deforestation and more, and I'd just love to know for our viewers, what has stood out to you?
Well, look, on the one hand, we can never take our foot off the pedal of the climate emergency. So we know we need to go farther, faster, and in virtually every domain. This is the code red for humanity that we've heard from the Secretary General and others. But we've already seen important advances in Glasgow this week. You mentioned a few of them already that I think are encouraging. The direction of travel continues to be the right one. Everyone's point of reference now is net zero. 90% of the global economy has made net zero pledges. So that's a critical development. And now all the focus is turning to delivery, to implementation, to how do we get to the goal of net zero as countries and others have set them. So what are the first steps? What are the next steps we need to take? I think Glasgow is reminding us of that imperative already, both in the commitments and in some of the specific coalitions that are coming together around action. And it's also, really reminding us that these processes, these conferences of parties, they're really an ecosystem of effort. It's the leaders, it's the diplomats and the negotiators, but it's also mayors and governors, investors. We heard incredible announcements today from the investing community. It's citizens. So, that's what really defines the collective action we need to take in the climate emergency. It needs all of us. And I think it's really encouraging to see already how much of that is here.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up the breadth of it, but also the need to implement. Certainly we're seeing this strong ambition here, both on the multilateral side, on the private sector pledges side, and perhaps, we'll have to see in, perhaps a week and a half in the formal outcome. But that leads me to asking something I think you just hinted at a moment ago, which is how can this high level of ambition, given that we're talking about, typically voluntary or non-binding pledges, what is the crosswalk from transforming this ambition that we're seeing on display here into on-the-ground reality, into on-the-ground policy in large emitting nations worldwide?
Well, it's a whole mix of things. It's incentives, it's pressures, it's politics. It's, we have seen, as you noted, incredible commitments now for a long period of time, but especially accelerating in this last year. I mentioned the net zero pledges. This group that's come together of over 100 countries saying we will end deforestation by 2030. They represent 85% of the world's forests. That's huge. The trillions of dollars under management that were represented by the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero this morning that spoke. But you're right, we have to hold people to it, whether that's countries or companies or other coalitions. So that's all where we get into the issues of delivery, of implementation, of accountability. So that requires ways of tracking that. It requires organizing around it. It very much does also require policy changes and regulatory changes that will send the right market signals so that there's an alignment of incentives with commitments and action.
Definitely. And speaking of those policy signals and that level of action, certainly one thing that I think is an important dynamic in the United States is that Congress has not yet acted on these fairly sweeping and large proposals from President Biden and Democratic leaders for much larger and expanded tax incentives and other types of important investments. How much is the absence of passage of what the president calls his Build Back Better agenda? How is the absence of enactment of that going to affect the talks here in your estimation? And perhaps what signs of that are you seeing already?
Look, I think what I see among leaders here and other delegations is a real recognition of the seriousness about climate that is reflected in the Biden administration at every level. That includes the bill that's right now under discussion in Congress, but not only that. So I think, first of all, people understand how serious the United States now is about climate ambition, and not just because it's a good thing to do, but it's a smart thing to do for our economic future. And even in its scaled back form, this bill still has $500 billion, $500 billion in climate and clean energy provisions, which would make it the largest climate investment legislation in American history. So it's still a very big deal. And I think we're very near agreement on all of it. I'd also point out that, the United States isn't just the federal government, it's importantly the federal government, but it's also governors and mayors. You have over half the governors in the country, Republican and Democratic, who are part of something called the U.S. Climate Alliance that unites all of them in climate ambition because they believe it's in the best interest of their constituents and their economies. So I think you have to look at the whole wraparound of what's going on in the United States to understand the real measure of climate ambition at play there.
Definitely. Yeah, certainly over the years, even as the Trump administration announced it was going to withdraw from Paris and then, of course, did toward the end, you certainly, I think, saw a lot of state efforts and non-state actor efforts certainly continuing. This summit is occurring under such extraordinary circumstances. There's the COVID testing requirements. There are other types of restrictions. And we've got these limits on delegations and civil society groups' access to some of the venues. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you see that perhaps affecting the unfolding conference here, especially as it relates to the civil society presence?
Well, look, I think we all benefit when there is robust, active, and ideally physically present engagement of civil society in all international processes. We also have seen over the last year how much this digital environment, we're obviously speaking to each other digitally as well, how much it's actually enabled even more diverse voices from civil society to come to the virtual table. So that's been a net gain that I hope we don't lose even as we come out of the COVID crisis. I think that's helped invigorate a lot of the energy around both the ambition that needs to be brought to the table. And again, I hope that will be sustained. I think people feel the pressure. Leaders feel the pressure. They obviously see what's happening in their economies. They see what's happening in their communities. They recognize the inequity and the environmental justice dimensions of this issue. And so I think even if there are fewer people here than there might have been in other years, I think the pressure and the demand from civil society is well known and very much felt. And rightly so.
One of the sort of notable things to me so far at the conference was President Biden's press conference, just as he was just before he departed. At that press conference, he said that China, quote, basically didn't show up, end quote, in terms of commitments. How do you read China's posture right now? If they're, of course, the largest emitter in the world by a mile, and they're so critical to progress on climate change.
Well, how much time do you have, Ben? It's a complex topic. I remember, as many people do, remember years ago, the US-China deal that preceded the Paris Agreement as being the thing that really broke the logjam of getting to Paris. So I think we all recognize the imperative China's climate leadership as well as US climate leadership. This would be a stronger conference if everybody were here. But just in September, China committed to ending external coal financing. That was a big deal. Of course, like every commitment, they need to be held to it. But I think it's a complex story about the Chinese economy, how they understand the future economy. They're making huge investments in renewable energy and other climate smart technologies, as well as all of the additional investments and activities that they need to change. So I think this is just about creating the right kind of conditions, pressures, demands. They won't want to be left out of this eventually. They can't be left out of this. This is an all hands on deck moment. And this is essentially a fight not only for a healthy future, but it's a fight for the global economy and the economic future. And that's in everyone's interest to race toward.
Thank you. And finally, Ambassador, now, as the world leaders have been departing, and I think some of the more specifics of the negotiation are starting to unfold here, over the next week and a half, when this all wraps up on November 12th, or maybe November 13th or 15th, who knows how long it'll ultimately go if it goes into overtime. But Ambassador, how will you ultimately define success insofar as whatever final agreement is reached here in Glasgow?
Well, I think there's not one metric. It's about whether people have really pushed themselves to reach the highest level that they can at this moment, and every moment demands the same. This isn't a Rubicon moment, right? Every single day counts. I'm always reminded of that saying about the best time to plant a tree. The first best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The next best time is today. The climate emergency is like that. There are things we should have done 10, 20, 30 years ago that we didn't do. All right, we didn't do them, but we can do them today. We can do them tomorrow. We can do them the next day. So I think we're going to get quite far in this COP. However far we get, we need to go farther the next day. That's simply the nature of this emergency that calls on all of us to rally in heroic new ways. So I'm encouraged by what we've seen so far, and I think we need to keep up the pressure.
Thank you, Ambassador Cousens. Certainly, yes, it's an important moment, but hardly the end of the story. And so I think we're going to make that the last word. I'd like to thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I look forward to seeing you again.
And next, we have a video from our sponsor, Bank of America.
Proterra is all about bringing clean, quiet, commercial vehicle, battery technology solutions to the communities that we serve and live in, with the ultimate ambition of protecting the environment.
We believe public transportation and the transit sector will be the first to fully electrify, and that has been our mission since day one. We design and manufacture electric powertrain systems and also charging infrastructure solutions for commercial fleets. That technology is here, the capability is here to deliver it and install it. With partners such as Bank of America, we stand ready to make our vision a reality and our cities more livable.
It's no longer a question of if economies will transform to clean energy solutions. It's now a question of how fast they'll transform. If we want our children and our children's children to enjoy the earth the way we've been able to enjoy it, it's incumbent on us to take a leadership role in bringing clean energy solutions to the communities that we live in and serve.
I'm Dave Lawler, and I'm the World News Editor for Axios, coming to you from Glasgow. Our final guest is the Administrator of the United Nations Development Program, Achim Steiner. He's joining us from New York, New York.
Hello, Dave. Good to be with you.
Likewise. So, Achim, it's day 3 here. I know you'll be coming over later in the summit, but so far we've had announcements on methane and deforestation, new pledges from countries, including India, but we've also heard the concerns of developing countries that we're on track to fall far short of what's needed. What do you make of what we've seen so far, and what do you think has to happen to make this a successful summit?
Well, I think you just mentioned a number of announcements that I think, first of all, send a positive signal. Glasgow is about raising the level of ambition. This is the Paris Agreement's inbuilt design mechanism to ratchet up ambitions 5 years after the first signing of the Paris Agreement. And in many ways, developing countries, as UNDP has been engaged with 120 of them in supporting them to review their national climate strategies, these nationally determined contributions that are now submitted to the climate COP, there is actually a significant amount of effort being undertaken in developing countries. So I would say, globally speaking, in terms of total emissions and where we need to be, we are still far behind. But we are seeing in many developing countries, certainly a raising of the level of ambition. And particularly coming to Glasgow, I think the expectation that truly we have a global climate partnership, which also leads us then to this big question of financing, which remains in many ways an issue that has not been resolved. But I think for the first 3 days, certainly there is a signal that on many different aspects of climate action, we are seeing some progress.
And I think there's a desire among the organizers and some participants here to kind of leave the rest of the world behind when we get here and just focus on climate issues, emissions cuts, and things. You've said that basically, we have to be mindful of the fact that we're still in a pandemic. Countries are facing very severe economic distress, and that these things should be sort of integrated into the conversation at COP. Do you think that's happening? Why do you think that's so important? And do you think that those concerns can be addressed sort of in combination with the climate issues that we're talking about here?
Well, you raise a very important point. We are still in the midst of a pandemic, and for many developing countries, it's not just the health crisis that it triggered, but it is really a social and economic crisis also. There are, at the moment, over 60 developing economies that are already facing potential debt distress. So that is an enormous constraint on them being able to invest in really making these transitions in the energy sector, in the mobility sector, in agriculture, in land use. And that is certainly one consideration that I think we have to put very much at the forefront, because we are facing a moment of both extraordinary challenge in terms of raising ambitions, at the same time doing so in the midst of a pandemic and an economically very stressful time. So I think from the perspective of being able to move forward quickly, it is essential that we look at the climate change related actions as also delivering co-benefits. It can be access to electricity, something that UNDP has committed over the next 4 years to try and help 500 million people gain access to clean, affordable energy. That's a development benefit, and it's a contribution to reducing the future emissions path. We can look at health and the implications of reducing, for instance, fossil fuel usage, and therefore reducing also the impact on people's health. More than 7 million people die prematurely every year across the world from indoor and outdoor pollution. And then there are also broader economic policies and signals. For instance, we just launched an advocacy campaign, but also an offer to developing countries to look at fossil fuel subsidies. Few people realize that $423 billion are every year spent on essentially artificially making fossil fuels cheaper. Now, that is often done in the name of poorer people, but in fact, we know that there are much more efficient ways of helping poor people gain access to affordable energy. Those $423 billion are not only holding back the transition to clean energy, they're in fact also wasting taxpayers' money. So these are some of the examples of how we need to look at climate change actions, not as an isolated set of actions, but really part of what has become in many capitals and countries now a narrative of a green recovery, building forward better. And I think that has to be very much part of the climate change negotiations.
Got it. And just before we started this, I was actually speaking to some leaders of small island countries. They're obviously bearing the brunt of this at the moment already. And for many of them, these timelines, 2050, 2060, 2070 to get to net zero, by then they'll be facing even more extreme issues. It's not just developing countries, or not just island countries. Obviously, African countries are also facing some of the worst effects of climate change. Can you talk about the imbalance there? And you mentioned the financing issue. That's one of the main focuses this week, finding more financing to help these countries adapt to climate change. Can you talk about how important that is, and maybe what you see as the barometer for success on that front?
Certainly, and I think we just have to remind ourselves of some of these extraordinary images that were on the news throughout this year in terms of natural disasters, be they hurricanes, be they the forest fires, be they floods. These extraordinary events that are going to increase with global heating essentially create conditions where a small island developing economy, for instance, could have 30 to 40% of its GDP wiped out in a 12-hour extreme weather event. And yet many of these small island developing states don't qualify for traditional development cooperation financing. So they're almost left to their own devices. And you can imagine what that does to a society, to an economy. Vulnerability and also the notions of adaptation have become terms that we very much associate with the discussions about financing on climate. And that is why many of us have called, including the Secretary General of the United Nations, that international climate finance needs to step up not only on mitigation, which is, for instance, investing and supporting countries in moving to cleaner energy, but also in adaptation, because many African countries right now are already spending millions and millions of dollars in adaptation, which essentially means just protecting what you already have, not investing in your development pathway forward on poverty eradication, access to energy, health services, but simply protecting what you have. So our international climate financing discussions have to move from this notion that this is some form of philanthropy or perhaps some short-term donations. We need to take a mindset of co-investing in one another, because the vulnerability of literally hundreds of millions of people exposed to the risks of climate change will affect the global economy, will affect us all. And so the discussions in Glasgow should really treat this $100 billion commitment that is now well over 10 years old and has not yet been fulfilled really as something that should be the minimum. It is the floor from which we look forward on how to be able to generate the trillions that ultimately will be needed to finance the kind of transitions we need. And literally within a time window of 10 years to 2030 for one milestone, and then over the next 20 years. These are the critical milestones. And without financing, we cannot, and certainly developing countries cannot deliver that part that they have also committed to already and are willing to pursue.
And do you think we're getting closer to that mindset that you said that's needed of co-investing in each other? It's not philanthropy. You know, these are payments that need to be made. Obviously, leaders are talking a lot about that. Boris Johnson's talked about it. President Biden has talked about it. But do you think there's actually the kind of movement that we need and the sense of urgency that we need?
I think the realization that this makes sense and that this has to be achieved is growing. And I think it is growing exponentially. And let us also recognize we are now at the 80 billion mark. Although, you know, that was a promise from 2009, repeated in 2015. So for many developing countries, this has also become an issue that has eroded their trust in international climate cooperation because they're always being confronted with greater demands and greater expectations on how to contribute to a net zero world in terms of carbon emissions. But the kind of partnership that has been promised to them, the commitments that have been made are still too slow. And I think what we have to essentially confront, particularly when we have just seen the world mobilize $14 trillion, largely in the richer world, to deal in 12 months with the pandemic, kind of illustrates that we have not given this the seriousness that it really deserves. It is still treated as a kind of nice to do, perhaps good to do. We have to go beyond that. The $100 billion must be simply a commitment that is now put in place. And that will also leverage, and this we often forget, hundreds of billions of dollars in developing country investments because they have to invest in their own energy infrastructure, in their own transport systems. This international co-financing is a way of accelerating the decarbonization. So at the end of the day, everyone gains, and in the absence of it, everyone loses.
And just to close us out here, you're a COP veteran. I'm a first timer. The leaders are leaving, but we still have about 2 weeks to go here. What are you watching for in the next couple of weeks as COP continues?
Well, first of all, the fact that over 100 heads of state and government came to Glasgow, I think signals that climate change really has arrived at the center of our not only political discussions in all these countries, but also in the thinking about how the future of our economies are going to evolve, particularly coming out of this crisis. So having the leaders at the beginning of a conference of the parties, I think, sets a good tone. It shows that there is political interest in arriving at a deal in Glasgow. And I think we should always remind ourselves that these climate conferences are 2 weeks in a calendar year of 365 days. Work doesn't stop, but they are an important moment for two reasons. One, the public can actually see their own leaders and the international community in the spotlight. You can, as a citizen, really watch who is helping to move us forward, who is slowing us down. And secondly, I think it is an opportunity also for face-to-face negotiations to tackle some of the extremely difficult issues. And compromise is, in a sense, the DNA of an international community of multilateralism, achieving that ability to act collectively. So to Glasgow, we look with a high expectation, but rest assured, the work will go on the day after Glasgow. And I think progress tells us that we are gaining momentum, but we are far behind in terms of time. That is our greatest concern right now. The time window is closing, and we are simply not acting fast enough. And that remains the task, literally on day one after Glasgow, to continue to work on that.
Well, that seems like a good place to leave it. Thank you, Achim, so much for joining Axios.
Thank you, Dave.
And next, we have a video from Bank of America, the sponsor of this event. Thank you all for joining this afternoon for another virtual conversation that has made everyone smarter faster. For more info or to sign up for the Axios World or Generate newsletters, visit axios.com/newsletters or visit us on the Axios app. Thank you all for joining, and we'll see you on axios.com.